Hello, everyone. My name is Bart Szewczyk. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at GMF, and I'm delighted to host today Alec Ross, and who will present his new book, The Raging 2020s. I guess a derivative of the Roaring 1920s, a book that points to some of the modern challenges of today's life and the evolutions of modern economies, both in the United States and around the world, and charts two potential paths forward and advises us on how hopefully to choose a better path and some of the downside risks of letting things evolve as they are. We are also delighted to have Kristine Berzina as commentator for our panel. Kristine covers geopolitics at GMF and has worked extensively on democratic resilience and the threat of technological interference by authoritarian states and democratic societies. So welcome again to all of you. Let me also just thank my colleagues at GMF, Sabrine Dow and Louise Langeby, for helping organize this event. We have a great turnout on both sides of the Atlantic, and without further ado, let me turn it over to Alec, who will give us a brief overview of the book and its core arguments and some of the questions that arise out of the book. Then we'll follow with Kristine to give her perspective on some of these themes, and hopefully we'll have a nice back and forth with questions from the audience as well. So now over to Alec, and give us again the highlights from your book and some of the core arguments that you try to explicate in your work.
Sure. Thank you, Bart. Good morning to all of you in the United States. Good afternoon to all of you in Europe. And thank you for this opportunity to talk about my book, The Raging 2020s. I promise this will be the only time that I do anything that crassly commercial. Look, I wrote this book, The Raging 2020s, because I felt like we were in a really difficult moment of transition, but in a moment of transition that has historic precedents. By way of quick background, my life is sort of at the intersection of entrepreneurship, academia, and government. You know, I've worked in the Obama administration, but I've also been an entrepreneur, and I'm now a business school professor. And it's interesting to me to see the dynamic as we enter into the 2020s. And this book tries to ask us a very simple question. Will the future look more like Star Trek or more like Mad Max? Will the future look more hopeful and promising and modern and inclusive, or are we tipping into a moment of increasing rage, distress, and disequilibrium? And the answer to that is it's still an open question. We still have agency. We are still in a position where we can ensure that the 2020s conclude better than they began. But we can't do so by just hoping that the decade concludes better than it began. By way of sort of framing this intellectually a little bit, I think that we are now in a sort of a new Engels pause. And when I say the Engels pause, I'm referring to a period of about 40 years, from 1800 to 1840, where through much of Europe, there was a process of very rapid industrialization, when the basis of the economy went from being dominantly agricultural to being dominantly industrial. But through this period, during the Engels pause, as enormous amounts of wealth were being created, that wealth was not being broadly shared. And for all intents and purposes, we didn't rewrite our social contract being that which sort of defines the rights and responsibilities between the governing, the governed, and business. And so for 40 years, there was this incredible dislocation as labor went from farm to factory, from country to city. But it was the sort of industrialization of the Charles Dickens novels of 11-year-olds losing their hands in the factory, of 6-day work weeks that lasted on average 14 hours a day. What were the results of that? The results of that was the largest wave of revolutions in Europe's history. The result were ideological movements like Marxism. The Communist Manifesto was written in 1848. But ultimately, industrialization worked because we rewrote our social contract. We reoriented the relationship between state capital and labor. We said, sure, you can work in that factory, but we're going to create this new thing called a minimum wage. We say, sure, you can work in that factory, but no more 11-year-olds losing their hand. We're going to create the world's first ever child labor law. Say, yes, you can work in that factory. And after 25 or 30 years, there's this crazy idea called a pension, which is after you work for us for 25 to 30 years, you can get a percentage of your income, you can retire and get a percentage of your income for the rest of your life. So things like a minimum wage, things like child labor laws, things like a pension, the concept of a weekend, free public education to share the benefits of industrialization. All of these created relative harmony in the relationship between state capital and labor, and industrialization worked. I also think about, as Bart referenced, the 1920s. The 1920s ended in economic distress and a period of rage. And it's interesting to me to think about European and American comparisons at that point. Benito Mussolini was democratically elected. Adolf Hitler was democratically elected. So we saw that with the economic distress, people tilted toward fascism and Nazism. In the United States, we went in a very different direction and got behind Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. I think we're in a new Engels pause where the nature of the economy is transitioning from being dominantly industrial-based to increasingly technology-rich and knowledge-based. But the basis of our social contract remains the same. And that doesn't really work so well anymore. I have 3 teenage children, and I'm certain that not one of those children will have a single employer for 30 years, at the end of which they'll get an employer-based pension. Most public education is designed to last until about ages 18 or 19, because the presumption was that 200 years ago at age 18 or 19, the elites would go on to university and the non-elites would go work in ports, factories, mines, or mills. But the nature of labor now is such that we all have to be lifelong learners, but we haven't really reoriented the concept of public education. So this book, The Raging 2020s, really tries to draw out what is producing so much rage right now. Why is there so much distress, disorientation, and illiberalism reaching into particularly Western democracies that we historically would have thought of as much more stable? And what's the path forward? And the only thing I'll say about the path forward here is the book doesn't attempt to use me as the sort of voice of God, saying these are the solutions, but rather looking globally at different models of growth, governance, and the social contract from which I think we can draw information and inspiration. The book is written by an American, but it's not an American book. It really does try to look at the 196 country chessboard and look at sort of the geographic orientation and models as broadly as possible. So with that, I'll hand things back over to Bart and Kristine. I'm again really pleased that you're all a part of this discussion with us this morning, and I hope that it prompts you to dig deeper and to engage and get a copy of The Raging 2020s. You're muted.
I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Oh. Sorry about that. That happens all the time. And here I was giving a great plug for the book, saying that not only should you get a copy of it, but you should also get it for your family and friends in this holiday season. Let me turn it over to Kristine now for your vantage point, having spent time professionally and educationally, both in the United States and in Europe, to see, from your work, what resonated with your research from the book, what other, additional insights you could offer.
Thanks so much, Bart, and thank you, Alec, for providing us this excellent book, which really gives us food for thought about how to detangle both the assessment of where we are today, but looking at solutions that could help us in the future. So I work for a corner of GMF that's called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And what we do is look at autocratic interference in democracies, largely in North America and Europe. But where we have evolved, as well as this whole conversation, is not just what are those actors out there who are trying to take advantage of us, largely Russia, China, Iran, what are they doing to us? But how do we make our own democracies and our societies more resilient against those threats? Because when we look at what Russia or China are doing, it is very often taking advantage of the divisions within our own society. And when you look at the last 10 years, and Alec points to some of these cleavages, it has been especially easy to take advantage of us. We are not providing a great deal of resilience and solidarity with each other within our societies to be best prepared to mount a resistance to some of these foreign issues. So what we see right now is this mix of great domestic challenges, vulnerabilities, and foreign players that are all too happy to use relatively inexpensive means to keep us unhappy and pointed at each other, whether it's information or cyber attacks or other tools. But when we look forward, I mean, we have these really interesting assessments of where we are. But this week, I sit just outside of Washington, D.C. right now. And this week, we will have the Summit for Democracy, something the Biden administration is pulling together with democracies from around the world to really look at some of the challenges and progress forward for democracy. Alec, you talk about governance and the role of governments and the importance of democracy in your book as well. But the ailing nature of the social systems of democracy as we have it is something that we really do need to tackle for domestic reasons for prosperity, but also for some of the big global competition as well, which you bring up, because it is a question of what is the model that's going to be most attractive. In Alec's book, there's this question of a Filipino family put in dire straits. Where might that family want to go? What model is going to be more attractive to them? That also applies whether you're sitting in Kansas or you're sitting in Wrocław, taking two completely random places. But what if you're just in a regular place seeking to have the best future for yourself and for your family? What is going to make sense to you? The way that we often think about democracy is really one about political system, who gets elected and how. But something that Alec's book starts with, which I think is incredibly important, is the story of the economy and the issues of how do you deliver services, deliver wealth, deliver a sense of access to citizens. This is incredibly important. And whether you talk about that in the sense of Delaware, as Alec does, and chicken farming, or you talk about other places, this is an incredibly important struggle. And how does that relate to the role of big corporations and the tools that would be available there? But at this question of how do you deal with corruption? How do you deal with kleptocracy? It's interesting to bridge, as we do at ASD and at GMF, and try to also take things from the conversations from the families, from the individual level, through various programs that we have at GMF to bring individuals from both sides of the Atlantic together to talk about their experiences. And how does that relate to big picture policy issues? How does that relate to tech taxation? Or how does that relate to broad, questions like kleptocracy, which are going to come up this week at the Summit for Democracy? Do we have tools already available to address some of these issues? Are there blind spots, loopholes that we haven't been committed enough to closing in our societies to make sure that we function better? That is on the table. There are people who are drumming very loudly to say we have tools and we have power of our own. We refuse to use it right now. And there are people who benefit in our societies from not using it. but maybe we should turn the tide on that. So perhaps this week is one moment in which we look at each other, come together as democratically leaning countries and say, actually, there are big scary factors out there, but we're no small potatoes ourselves. And we even have things on the books and tools at our disposal that could make us better. And if we don't, how do we do that together to improve ourselves, to make this picture and the future more equitable, more attractive to our own societies, as well as to the broader world? So that is, I think, a question that we look at. And I think so many of these things are in Alec's book, which is why I would like Alec talk a little bit more about what are those things that are missing, and what are the areas and the sectors that really need to be rethought as we move forward.
Thank you, Kristine. I'll respond to one piece of this, which I think is a really big piece, but I think an oft overlooked piece. You mentioned, where are the holes, where are the gaps, particularly across, within, and more importantly, in this case, across our democratic societies. One thing that I'll point to is the issue of tax, the issue of taxes. Our democracies, our governments in many respects are being starved of resources, because what's interesting, what's different, frankly, than the 1920s or the original Engels pause from 1800 to 1840s is the degree to which multinationals are actually protagonists within this. Facebook is a country. Amazon is a country. Google is a country. Apple is a country. And their CEOs are more powerful than the vast majority of prime ministers. I remember being in Italy with the CEO of one of these companies, one of the companies that I just named, and he wanted to be very quiet about his presence there so that the prime minister wouldn't hear that he was there, because then he would be obligated to meet with him. And he was like, oh, I hate traveling in all these countries, and I have to meet the head of, if they know that I'm there, I have to meet the head of state. The dismissiveness by that CEO demonstrated his power relative to the prime ministers. It was interesting. And what's interesting about these large multinationals and their impact across democratic societies right now is, in many respects, they get to individualize their own corporate social contract. They can choose the labor and environmental regulations of China, the research and capital markets of the United States, the tax policies of tax havens. So they in many respects, without democratic accountability, are able to have a global reach in a way that impacts geopolitics in extremely consequential ways. And one thing that I focus on with a little bit of depth here is on tax. And so we're in this really tricky position right now because the world's wealthiest individuals and corporations are able to legally, and the key word here is legally, these aren't criminals. The fact that the world's wealthiest individuals and corporations are able to legally pay nearly zero tax starves our democratic governments of resources that could be used to deliver for taxpayers. And what it means is that working and middle class members of society end up paying for everybody. They end up paying their own taxes. They're paying the taxes of the wealthiest individuals and corporations that are not paying tax. And they're having to pay taxes for low-income members of their societies who tend to be net consumers of government resources. So a lot of the rage, a lot of the distress in our democratic societies, and therefore a lot of the radicalization that's taking place right now, is not among the poor. It's among working and middle classes. If you look at the base, for example, of Donald Trump's support, I'm from the coal-filled hills of West Virginia. The base of his support comes from communities like the one that I grew up in, which tend to be overwhelmingly blue collar, but not poor. If you look at the radicalization that's taking place, irrespective of right versus left, it tends to come from people who feel like they are paying into the system, but not getting out much. And so the one thing that I do focus on in earnest in this book, and where, frankly, I think some very positive steps are being taken, for example, with the idea of a global minimum tax for corporations. Things like this might seem obscure. It may seem like stuff for, the middle or back pages of the FT, but not for, the attention of normal people. But I got news for you. These things will have a far bigger impact on our lives than we would otherwise know. So I do think that that making sure that the world's wealthiest individuals and corporations are paying into our democratic systems as opposed to harvesting resources from our systems and playing, frankly, more a role of tax collector than taxpayer, I think would do a lot to strengthen our democracies and to, in part, by increasing its resource base without that resource base having to be increased by the hard-earned money of our working and middle classes.
That's great. Thanks so much, Alec and Kristine as well. I wanted to ask you to flesh out a little bit of one part of your argument in your book, which is, the shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, but even going beyond the sort of, maybe if you could just, describe that shift at the philosophical macro level, but also go a bit further and point to some of the things that you discussed in terms of practical steps that could be taken to concretize this idea of stakeholder capitalism and what it would look like and what turns on these debates.
Sure. Thank you for that, Bart. So by way of very quick definition, for those of you who may not know, shareholder capitalism was an idea fostered out of the University of Chicago, which basically said the sole goal, the sole role of a corporation is to maximize the returns to shareholders. So that if €1 is earned, before 1 cent goes to any stakeholder that is not a shareholder, meaning an employee, the surrounding community, whatever it is, it has to ultimately benefit the shareholder even more. Stakeholder capitalism views the corporation a little bit differently. It says, yes, we are capitalists. So stakeholder capitalism is a form of capitalism. But it says that it basically asserts that there will be an equitable distribution of profits to shareholders, to employees, to the surrounding community and community institutions, and for things, for our overall benefit, like our climate and environment. Stakeholder capitalism was the dominant form of capitalism from World War II into the 1980s. And in fact, the period of greatest economic growth in the history of the United States took place during the heyday of stakeholder capitalism. But our capitalism foundered a bit in the 1970s. We saw lower levels of growth with higher levels of inflation. And so this then created the conditions that enabled the rise of shareholder capitalism, and it was championed in government by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, by Ronald Reagan in the USA, and it sort of reoriented the role of the corporation in society. And this has had, I argue, a fairly malignant impact on most of our societies. So again, I'll just use the United States as a reference point here. The distribution of headquarters of big companies used to be a substantial amount of distribution. All 50 states of the United States of America had at least one important headquarters, and the children of the CEO would go to the same school as the children as the children of the middle managers. And in addition to making a multi-generational commitment to those communities, it would do things like, if there was a short-term economic downturn and sort of the MBA's analysis said, oh, we should hire X number of people, the corporation would say, we're going to wait before we start firing people. Even if our Microsoft Excel spreadsheet says we can save money over the short term by firing people, we're going to hold until we really need to fire people. But then with the rise of shareholder capitalism, a couple of things happened. First, the headquarters went to tax optimized locations. Again, in this case, around the United States. So instead of companies being based in the so-called American heartland, they all pushed into Delaware, into Florida, and into Texas, places with low or no taxes. In Europe, we saw the reincorporation of many companies into tax havens, whether those were, in Luxembourg, Monaco. We saw, brands that we associate with a national identity. When you actually dig down a little bit, they are technically incorporated in tax havens. We also saw a malignant impact in terms of share buybacks. So what do I mean by this? What a share buyback is, when you generate a profit, instead of giving those profits away in the form of dividends or investing in research and development or higher wages, if what your job is in shareholder capitalism is to maximize return to shareholders, one of the ways to maximize return to shareholders is to buy as much of your own company's stock as possible to reduce the supply, to reduce the float, and therefore increase the share price. What is the negative effect of this? Well, first of all, obviously, it's not going into the quote unquote real economy. It's not going into research and development. It's not going into your employees. But the worst effect, I'll just give one example. America's 5 largest airlines over the previous 10 years had $48 billion in free cash flow. It spent $45 billion of that $48 billion on stock buybacks. And then when the pandemic hit, when COVID hit, they said they needed a bailout. They needed a bailout to be able to continue to keep their planes in the air, but they couldn't tap that $45 billion because they'd used it to buy back their shares. So this, in my opinion, is not capitalism. It's corporate socialism, where you are privatizing the gains, but socializing the costs. You're privatizing the gains to shareholders, but you're socializing the costs to taxpayers. And so now I do believe that shareholder capitalism has created this dynamic where only the owners of capital, only shareholders, by and large, have been the beneficiaries of the growth of our capitalism over the last 30 years, where everybody, frankly, below the top 10% have not. I'll conclude this point by just giving one data point. Again, I'll reference the United States. 30 years ago, so not that long ago, back when I was an undergraduate in university, if you go back 30 years, over the last 30 years, in the United States, the top 1% has grown $21 trillion wealthier, trillion with a T, $21 trillion wealthier, while the lower 50% has grown $900 billion poorer, and the middle class has stagnated. So this has created an almost Mad Max-like state of inequality in the United States, and it's a direct byproduct, Bart, of shareholder capitalism.
I jump in a couple of these things because I found this an incredibly interesting part of the book. But also I recommend not reading this part of the book and then trying to go to sleep, because that doesn't work. So don't do that. Read it in the morning and have a day to process it, as opposed to spending your night attempting to do that. So a warning there. But I think a different part that, Alec, you're not mentioning here is why it's okay to do this, which is the antitrust argument for what is the cost. I mean, how do you measure the effect upon citizens? Well, if you measure the effect upon consumers and you look at something from chicken prices to airline ticket prices, there is a difference between what it was in 1980 and what it is today. So what is the cost of lower consumer prices is a different way of looking at it, because it's not all terrible for consumers. We're making the argument, and I think probably Alec and I would agree that there are very harmful social, democratic, therefore foreign policy elements of this. But it is based on the fact that the chicken breast is cheaper and the seat is cheaper, right? So it's not. I will just put that there. It's not entirely, it isn't making the products more expensive, as you have many of these harmful social dynamics involved.
I was also going to offer a third category, which is probably more familiar in your world, Kristine, which is that of authoritarian capitalism, and where in places like Russia, basically everything is ultimately viewed from the perspective of how does it benefit a certain group of decision makers at the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid of the whole structure. Alec, if I could ask you to go a little bit further, because even though it's true, you might need a little bit of time to reflect on this particular chapter. I found it quite interesting because you go a little bit further and then discuss how countries and companies might take practical steps to try to have certain benchmarks for this move towards stakeholder capitalism, because of course you point out naturally people will want to showcase the good things that they're doing, but you probably would want, or in theory you could at least have certain criteria just like you have on climate change and environmental commitments and so forth in these other categories. So if you had the ear of the participants at the upcoming Alliance for Democracy Summit, what would you want to have them focus on in this shift from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism?
Yeah, so the danger here is that when most companies do something that, in many respects you might call stakeholder capitalism, it's too often rooted in PR. It's about looking good, it's about looking responsible. And while there are companies that do good and are responsible, the ultimate problem here is there are two big problems: incentives and measurements. So first, on incentives, we are all governed by incentives. And whether it's incentives for love, for power, for money, one thing that distinguishes human beings from most animals is we have this hyper individualized orientation to maximize our own health and well-being, oftentimes at the expense of the collective. The way to reorient the behavior of corporation is to create incentives. And you can create incentives through regulation. You can create incentives through creating opportunities for investment. But if you look, for example, at energy production and consumption in Northern Europe right now, what we've seen is the success of reorienting incentives to make it more market worthy, to make the production and consumption of clean energy comparatively more advantageous versus fossil fuels. But in a pure market orientation, it's impossible right now for clean energy to compete with fossil fuels. You have to change the incentives. And so this is a case where I think, frankly, European states do a much better job than the United States in reorienting the incentives. The United States tends to be much more deregulatory in this respect. But if you don't change the incentives, you don't change the behavior. The second thing is measurements. It's not good enough to just sort of say we're going to, kumbaya capitalism, cute capitalism that is caring. Nobody cares about that. You have to have, if you are a CEO, you didn't become a CEO because you're a caring person, because you're a nice person, because you're a big-hearted person. No, you became a CEO because you are driven by a set of concrete goals with metrics, and you're good at executing against that. And so a big gap, I believe, in stakeholder capitalism is we don't have a uniform set of measurements that we can use to demonstrate performance and accountability. There's an entire industry dedicated to assessing the economic health of a company. Things like generally accepted accounting principles. If you look at the back of any annual report of any big company, there are 10 pages of financials, and there are a lot of different ways of assessing the health and well-being of a company, from the price-earnings ratio to earnings before, to EBITDA, to return on equity. But we don't really have those measurements yet for stakeholder capitalism. So if I were sitting down with leaders from both the public and private sectors in this respect, I would say, in the same way in which we cohered financial reporting across the West to allow for greater economic integration in a world of free trade and capitalism, so too, if we want to execute against the goals of stakeholder capitalism, whether it's reduced inequality, whether it is a more responsible climate and environmental record, you have to have the transparent, widely accepted measures that, a company, whether it's in Germany or in Spain or in the United States or in Mexico, there's a similar accounting and there's similar accounting and transparency in the same way in which there is on the shareholder side of capitalism.
Thanks very much for that. And before turning over to Kristine, let me just encourage and remind everyone participating that you can submit your questions within the Q&A function, and I'll feed them to Kristine and Alec, or both of them as you wish. But let me first turn it over to Kristine for any feedback or any follow-up points.
The question of how do you formalize the structures or the incentives in order to make progress, where it isn't just like, oh, we want to be better, we want to care, which then often relates to some kind of greenwashing, or if in the climate sense, or other practices in which you don't fundamentally change anything, but you simply talk about minute changes that actually take place and use those to portray or to try to portray a transformation that isn't really happening. This is a big question, not only in a corporate structure, but also in a democratic and governmental structure, which is how do we come up with then real targets for evolution, for change? How do we measure inclusivity? There are various international NGOs that measure democratic health. They have the International IDEA based in Stockholm, for example, that has this Global State of Democracy report that, for example, the US is doing worse in and it is backsliding on democracy. But does that matter, right? I mean, that is an outside factor. How do we, if we look at the climate change process and something like COP, where countries really have a commitment to improvement, how do we make this not simply, oh, we all like to come together and talk about how we're failing or how we don't like polarization in our societies, whether in a US context, you're a Democrat or Republican, or in the UK, let's say Tory or Labour, right? Which are, in both of these senses, you have greater polarization and difference on the sides. No one really likes that, but really, what do we need to build in place? What are the building blocks required to say, let's have the same conversation? Let's put in incentives or metrics that will measure or keep us accountable for these changes. And I think that kind of practical thinking is something that really is necessary in this next decade. A call to action based upon the bad place that we find ourselves in 2021 is important, but without that practical movement, I think none of these questions, from corporate to governance, democracy, international cooperation, trust building, whether it's on a community level or across countries, that won't move forward.
Yeah, no, Kristine, I agree with you. And what I would love to see is, in the same way in which PwC, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, all of the big accounting firms have a uniform approach and a universally accepted way of doing accounting for shareholder metrics. What I would love is if we had a world where we could have that same kind of accounting process for stakeholder metrics. And that's really the gap. And so this might seem counterintuitive, but if you were to say, all right, how do we get that practical? I would actually involve PwC, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, alongside a lot of the larger private sector stakeholders, consultancies, the Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey types, and others, to see if there can be broadly accepted uniform reporting. And of course, this would be very difficult. Representation would be difficult. But until we actually do that work, it's all going to be, stakeholder capitalism is going to be dominated by PR.
And I guess that your fundamental point is that this might be difficult, it might take some time, but it's not an impossible endeavor. I remember one former US official who came from the private sector pointed out that, in business, his role was relatively straightforward because at that point it was to maximize shareholder profits, and you have a pretty clear benchmark for what you're doing, whether it's correct or not. Whereas in government, it was a lot more complicated because you had a lot of different objectives to pursue. In some ways, you're saying, and this also ties into another part of your book, businesses, or at least some of the largest multinationals, their task in this stakeholder capitalism world has become a lot more complicated in terms of measuring success and whether they're making the right decisions or not. And in some ways, they've become, their task has become as difficult as that of policymakers, because they have, or they should have, a range of different objectives that they should pursue. And so I wanted to tie to that sort of provocative part of your book, which is titled, "Should Businesses Have Their Own State Department, Pentagon, and CIA?" Which you sort of left open at the end, I guess with a nod towards yes, probably, but maybe flesh out that argument and point out, some of the gaps that you identified, and what do you mean by saying that businesses should have their own State Department, Pentagon, and CIA, and what should these departmental units within the businesses do in practice?
Yeah, so it's a deliberately provocative frame. Should a big company have its own CIA? Should a big company have its own State Department? Should it have its own Defense Department? Here's the point of that provocation. In many respects, we are more governed by companies than we are by governments. The 10 biggest companies in the world have a bigger impact on my family's life than the world's 10 biggest and most powerful governments. My family is more governed by Google, more governed by Apple, more governed by the big banks than they are by the Federal Communications Commission, what have you. So what I mean when I say these companies need to build these capabilities, it's rooted, and I'm not going to be very diplomatic right now, but I don't care. A lot of these companies are started by young engineers who grew very wealthy very young. And there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. So they are very intelligent, they have high IQs, but they aren't very wise. They aren't very worldly. There aren't that many good old-fashioned ink stamps in their passports. Yet these companies play increasingly consequential roles geopolitically and geoeconomically. And so what I believe is that in order for these companies to become more responsible, they actually, in addition to all of their engineers, need to bring people into their companies who are more sophisticated about geopolitics and geoeconomics, and not just for the purpose of lobbying, okay? But to also assess the impact of their work to help inform the direction of a product that is going to be consequential geopolitically or geoeconomically. So this is in significant part what I mean. I also believe that it is specific to defense. One of the things that I say is, should every big company have its own Pentagon? What I mean in this respect is I'm talking actually specifically about cybersecurity. I believe that the weaponization of code is the most significant development in conflict since the weaponization of fissile material. But unlike a nuclear weapon, which requires access to the scarcest of scarce scientific talent and trans-uranium elements, the development of a cyber weapon has a much lower barrier to entry. And unlike weapons of the past, missiles, M16s or what have you, which were largely a part of state conflict and therefore governed by states and around which a treaty-making structure existed between states, unfortunately, right now, relations between the United States, China, and Russia are such now that the idea of having a treaty rooted in cyber is impossible. And unlike, say, missiles, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, or what have you, these cyber weapons exist in and between the public and private sectors. So corporations actually have to become increasingly sophisticated cyber actors for them to protect themselves. And so as companies become more and more like countries in terms of their size, in terms of their power, and oftentimes in terms of their responsibilities, I would argue that we need some of the same aptitudes that we tend to associate with the smartest actors in government going inside some of these corporations.
One quick question to Alec, which is going back to this, Bart brought up authoritarian capitalism. What do you think would be the effect? Because it's not just Apple and Google competing against each other, right? And I think you could get a fair portion of societies in the countries, in the United States, or getting Nokia or Ericsson, also in Europe, to care, right? In a democratically founded society, some of the issues that you're mentioning are concerned. But what do you do? Does it cost anything globally? What is the risk for bringing about a more stakeholder approach when these companies are in practice competing against the Huawei's, competing against institutions that do not have the same pressures, do not have the same values, and will not play by the same rules in the short and medium term, certainly. So can we afford to do that?
Yeah, and you actually have an interesting discussion of Uber China and Didi in that respect, which might highlight some of the tensions that Kristine highlighted.
Yeah, so first of all, I would argue that so Uber and Didi I think it's an interesting example where what the Chinese did is they effectively closed the Chinese market to new market entrants from the United States. They kicked out Amazon, they made it impossible for Google to operate, they made it impossible for eBay to operate, and they made it China is to great software companies what Afghanistan is into great powers. Afghanistan was unconquerable by the USSR and USA, and China is unconquerable by Amazon and Google. In terms of competitiveness, there's absolutely no question that competition is global now. It's not, it's between Uber and Didi, it's with the Huawei's, it's with the Alibabas and what have you. What I would say is that I don't think the Western companies are going to become decreasingly competitive because of stakeholder capitalism. Because ultimately, whether these companies win or lose, they tend not to be balance sheet battles. They tend to be product battles or geopolitical battles. Alibaba has all of the economic might in the world, but it hasn't really been able to crack into the United States because its product set is misaligned with the United States and because it's geopolitically misaligned with the United States. So I think that ultimately ultimately I think that the Western companies will make an argument, and they do make an argument that, if they are increasingly regulated, if they are bound to a more stakeholder versus shareholder model of capitalism, it disadvantages them relative to China. But I find that a deeply unconvincing argument. Facebook is not really competing with Chinese social media right now. So when Mark Zuckerberg makes the argument that they can't be regulated because it advantages the Chinese, I don't see the causality between an increased level of regulation and an increased market share for Chinese firms. And I similarly don't see it in telecoms. So I would have to see actual concrete evidence of causality, of some kind of correlation. And to this point, I haven't.
There were a few questions in the Q&A relating to sort of the experience of income inequality, both in the US and in Europe. And it's interesting to actually note that, the story that you sort of tell of increasing inequality over the past 40 years or so, since the late 1970s, early 1980s, and era of deregulation and so forth, that certainly, that tracks with increasing income inequality in the United States. And you have this Gini coefficient that tracks that phenomenon and the Gini coefficient kept increasing over those 4 decades. In Europe, the story is a little bit more complicated, where, if you look at all of continental Europe, and let's say including the UK and Ireland and Norway within the batch, the income inequalities increased initially during the 1990s as sort of, countries of Eastern Europe were measured alongside countries of Western Europe. But the experience has actually been that, overall income inequality within Europe has steadily either plateaued or decreased, in fact, over the past, 20, 30 years. And in some cases, within specific countries has decreased as well. I mean, there are lots of countries in Europe, so each country's experience will be a little bit different. But the story has been a little bit distinct on the two sides of the Atlantic, and maybe it might be a good segue to discussing some of the future scenarios that you discuss in your book, and the different models that societies can adopt as a way of self-government, and making sure that the rules of the social contract that we have for today and the near-term future are updated. So can you just discuss the China model, the Nordic model, and other models that you highlight in your book, and some of the pros and cons that each model entails?
Sure, thank you for that. And look, I'll make a note that your point about the increasing Gini coefficient in the United States and the decreasing Gini coefficient the decreasing or stable Gini coefficient across many European states is in many respects an indicator of why there's so much more rage in the United States. It's not entirely economic, but I would argue that at the heart of a lot of the rage is something economic, whether it's the barista at Starbucks that makes minimum wage who goes to the very far left, or it is somebody from my native West Virginia, sort of the emasculated 55-year-old white man who hasn't seen his income go up in 40 years, and he goes to the far right. There's still an economic core to the argument. And there's a reason why in the United States we have much more violent protest movements than you see in Europe. Europe had the Gilets jaunes, the Cinque Stelle movement in Italy, Brexit in the UK. So it's not that there isn't anxiety or even low levels of rage, but it's not like it is in the United States, where it is violent and where it's growing increasingly violent, and where the level of radicalization is accelerating so much. To your question about the models, a lot of what I do focus on is the competing models for the social contract. I focus a fair bit on the Chinese model, which, as we know, is very hierarchical. It's rooted in government. It's top down from Beijing, and it has its distinct advantages. When you think about areas of growth, for example, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robotics, in a country of $1.3 billion with concentrated power, what they are able to do that we aren't in a country like the United States is they are able to have a national 10-year strategy for artificial intelligence. And it's not covert, it's overt. They publish online what their 10-year strategy is, and they are overt about the way in which this integrates into their private sector. So in many respects, the distinction between the public and private sectors in China are a distinction without meaning. And whenever anybody tests that, for example, what Jack Ma did this past year, the government, Xi Jinping, has proven that there is no company, there is no individual who is too powerful to be governed by Beijing, which is why Jack Ma is in Ibiza right now, and why he was brought to heel, despite being the most famous and most powerful businessman in China. So we know what the Chinese model is. And the Chinese model is further enabled by the surveillance infrastructure it is set up. There are now more than 400 million surveillance cameras in China. And the social contract there it has been further enabled by this digital surveillance infrastructure and by the social scoring system that it's put in place. And basically the promise from the governing to the governed is one of stability and growth. They say, we are going to have this system in place and it will deliver stability and growth, harmonious growth. The United States model, by contrast, is highly individualistic. It's more dynamic. It is less regulated. It produces more breakthrough innovations. It's not a coincidence that the two mRNA COVID-19 vaccines are in American companies. But by the same token, that hyper individualization and that hyper freedom and the lack of sort of payback into the system means that a lot of people are left behind. Within this between this, in certain respects, is Europe. And for me, the question for Europe is not, do they go in a more authoritarian direction or in a more laissez-faire direction, but it's can Europe have its own model of governance and growth, its own model of capitalism that is neither American nor Chinese. Right now, I think about it almost like a football match where there are two teams on the pitch. One is Chinese, one is American, and the Europeans too often play the role of referee, handing out yellow cards. Now, the role of the referee is important, but the referee never wins the game. And my counsel to my European counterparts right now, and when I speak to government leaders from Europe, is don't try to be the referee in a match between the United States and China. Put your own team on the pitch, your own models of growth and governance that reflect your values, as opposed to deciding that you have to choose one or the other or refereeing between the two.
And Kristine, if we could turn to you for some closing thoughts. Again, given that you've spent quite a bit of time both in Europe and in the United States, how you see different approaches to some of these fundamental issues on both sides of the Atlantic.
When you look at the global scene and you look at the values espoused by China, for example, or the Kremlin, then the US and Europe are very close together. And I think maybe that is something that is lost often in the conversation. Yet at the same time, the US and the US are very different. The US and Europe are also very different in the question of values and in the question of what kinds of inequities can be tolerated. When you take a train from Grand Central Station to New Haven in Connecticut, you go from Manhattan of incredible wealth to the Bronx of poverty, to Greenwich, Connecticut of also incredible wealth, to Bridgeport, which is a post-industrial struggling place. You don't have to leave a train. You don't have to spend more than 2 hours, and you see shocking income disparities. That would not be tolerable in a European context. How the US moves forward from this state of inequality and from the state of polarization is incredibly important and challenging. And Europe faces many of the same issues, but the disparities are not quite as great. I will make a plug that I think the Germans think of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine as theirs because of the innovation there. But I think the question of who could innovate, who could come up with solutions, and who can apply them in a way that is most acceptable to societies is a question that really is, as Alec was saying, a question for this decade that needs to be solved. The willingness to learn from each other, to see, to come to the table, as I hope people do this week for the Summit for Democracy, but also continue in a practical way. This will be incredibly important, and there will be gigantic costs to pay if we don't come up with solutions, on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thanks so much, Kristine. Before turning over to Alec for his closing thoughts, and we're at the hour, let me just thank again Sabrine for helping organize this event. Put again a plug to get the book online or at your local bookstores. And if you've enjoyed the discussion today and enjoyed the book, you can also get Alec's previous book on the industries of the future, which have still a lot of pertinent points currently. So, Alec, over to you for your closing remarks.
So thank you all for participating today. What I will simply conclude by saying is, whether the future looks more like Star Trek or more like Mad Max is entirely up to us. But the thing that I think we have learned over the last few years is that, particularly in the United States, it isn't inevitable that we make the right choices. It isn't inevitable that the United States enables the continual realization of a better and brighter future. And so we are in this moment of dislocation right now. I choose to be optimistic, despite its title, The Raging 2020s. I do think that it is ultimately an optimistic book because I do believe that we know what a lot of the solutions are. They're difficult to arrive at, but I choose to be optimistic about our ability to get there. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you, Kristine, for your very, very thoughtful commentary. Thank you, Bart, for organizing this and for your questions. And thank you all for any consideration that you might give to picking up a copy of The Raging 2020s.
Great. Thanks so much. Happy holidays, everyone. Bye-bye.